We are so excited to welcome everyone to the final round of the 2024 ACC Debate Championship. We have with us two amazing teams. On the affirmative, we have Wake Forest University. On the negative, we have the University of Miami. Before we jump into the mechanics of the debate, we have some thank yous. First and foremost, we have to say thank you to the ACC Academic Consortium for supporting this tournament for now in its 9th year, for an amazing opportunity for undergraduates across the ACC to show off their brilliance and to demonstrate that there are opportunities for research-based, civic-engaged debates that do amazing things, not only for the realm of competition, but for the public at large. And if you're watching this right now, we're going to show you an amazing treat this evening. Second thank you we have is to Leslie Stevens from the ACC Academic Consortium, who came to see it in person, not just in limited. Thank you so much for coming and being a part of it. It's been a joy to have this part of the ACC experience. Third, we want to thank our physical host, the Wake Forest Washington Center, which has been a great facility with amazing spaces for debate and for hanging out. Thank you to Jennifer Richwine, the Executive Director of the Wake Forest Washington Center, for hosting us here. Thank you so much. Next, we have to thank the debaters. All day long, from the start of this morning, they came from the hotel and jumped straight into the madness. And by that, I mean they debated both sides of the controversial question of whether or not we should have term limits for Supreme Court justices. And while this is no doubt going to be an amazing debate, earlier today, there were iterations of this taking place across this building that were also phenomenal debates. Every time a person stands and delivers, it carries risk. And these students took that risk today to both educate themselves before they showed up, to educate each other through the course of the debates, and to give all of us as observers a chance to see the brilliant future that we have with these amazing students going on to do amazing things. So to the debaters, thank you all very much. The last thank you is to our final round judges. So I'd like to begin by saying thank you to James Rowland, who's the Senior Director for the Center of Civic and Community Engagement at Emory University and Executive Director of the Atlanta Urban Debate League. Thank you, James, for bringing us all. Thank you to Paul Hayes, who's the former Director of Debate at George Washington, a longtime supporter of this tournament, including helping us host it at the George Washington campus for many a year, and he is now the team leader at IBF Connect. Thank you for being here. And finally, serving in the role of chair this evening is Ed Lee, who is the Senior Director for Inclusivity for Emory College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you for serving as chair. And now for the fun part. I get to get out of the way and turn it over to these four amazing debaters to give you a spectacular debate about term limits for Supreme Court justices. A round of applause for our finalists once again.
Americans overwhelmingly do not trust the Supreme Court to make legitimate decisions. Eisen and Matsuki of the Brookings Institute noted in 22 that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Polling showed that crashing public trust in the court is happening and endangering a crucial democratic institution. Only 48% of Americans now have a favorable opinion of the court, and Americans are looking for term limits. This is further magnified when one considers that since Nixon, 15 out of the 19 justices were appointed by Republicans and have served 77% of justice years. According to Adam Chilton, professor of law at Chicago with others, stated in 2021, that this loss of legitimacy seizes basic governance. A chance for a court to rule on an election, whether in 2024 or 2028 or at any time in the future, is extremely high. As for reestablishing legitimacy through term limits puts our entire rule of law in danger and risks massive civil violence. Beauchamp, senior correspondent at Vox, also notes in 2022 that in 1832, Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee Nation constituted a sovereignty entity with rights that cannot be overruled by state governments. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, escalated policies at ethnic cleansing, where the Worcester state case illustrated the Supreme Court only has power in as much as people believe it does. Roe v. Wade is another significant blow. The issue not just is that Americans disagree with the ruling, it's that the process has exposed the court as a vessel for politics by other means. Collapse of legitimacy sets the stage for a constitutional crisis. Political scientists show evidence linking the decline in court legitimacy to partisan warfare. Rush to fill the position decreased Democratic voters' faith without improving it for Republicans. Where Trump is to run, the court's inability to credibly perform could precipitate a Democratic crisis. There will be a significant litigation surrounding the 2024 contest. If the court rules in favor of Trump's claims, there's a very real chance that Democrats do not accept the ruling as illegitimate or even binding, nor does the court's pro-GOP tool guarantee legitimacy if it favors for Biden. That's a recipe for instability and even outright civil violence. We're seeing the degree to which America's democratic institutions are degrading and even at risk of failure. Even if legitimacy is not a primary concern, term limits would increase the chances that the most qualified judges are selected and reduce contention, since it will happen every 2 years for more compromised and moderate judges. Erwin Chemerinsky, a well-renowned constitutional legal scholar, noted in 2016 that term limits could give the president more incentive to nominate the most qualified candidates, and a term limit regime could lead to a less contentious nomination process and eliminate when an appointment arises close to a presidential election. Term limits could also help reduce the current partisan warfare if the opposing party knows that there will be another nomination in 2 years. That reduces the stakes and helps facilitate compromise. Extreme conservatism puts at risk our global climate change, LGBTQ livelihoods, minority rights, and the separation of church and state, putting a number of present and future lives at risk. Bonvente in 23 notes that 6 justice majorities of Republican appointees are politically conservative. The majority has bore political conservative fruit, and the 6 has little patience for death inmates, as well as constitutional causes of action. For example, 6-3 majority narrowed the rights to bring claims against the government offenders, as well as in relation to women, minority, LGBT rights, where the 6 upheld Mississippi's law prohibiting abortion, overruling Roe v. Wade. 6 ruled that affirmative action and admissions violates constitutional equal protection, and that Sotomayor and Jackson denounced the majority's disregard of entrenched racial inequality. The majority has a superficial rule of color blindness. 6 also decided laws that prohibit sexual orientation discrimination must sometimes give way to religious objections. A majority has rejected to keep church and the state separate, and the nation's law is profoundly different than it otherwise would be because there's a 6-3 conservative supermajority. Therefore, today, we affirm the Supreme Court should have term limits. For purposes of keeping the debate in the most mainstream possible way, we will defend the most commonly advanced proposal, that term limits of 18 years are appointed every 2 years effective immediately. That will likely happen through a constitutional amendment. Term limits works. While there will be an inevitable tension with court decisions, the process is imperative. Term limits will give Americans the belief that their vote is tied to legal decision-making. Adam Choatin, a professor of law at Chicago and others, stated in 2021 that timing of justices' deaths and retirements could lead to a court in which one party's nominee are disproportionately represented. The problem lies in an unfairness to the voters who elect a given president to a given term. This might be less of a problem if the Supreme Court justices' ideologies did not track the president, but there is overwhelming evidence that it does. The court bears only an indirect relation to national elections, but the term lengths equalize each president's term impact on the Supreme Court, which could help alleviate this conflict. Term limit increases and creates turnovers, which allows for the increase of legitimacy of its own decisions. Eisen and Masuki, cited above, also say that tenure limits ensure a cyclical and predictable turnover this will allow to ensure one president or party does not influence the court. Turnover will mean justices are less insinuated from everyday life. And we'd like to end with a simple laundry list of problems that unpacks the problem with our current model and method of appointment. Adam Choatin, also cited above, says that reformers have raised a number of concerns, such as life tenure into old age when mental deterioration increases. Life tenure incentivizes presidents to choose younger appointees. This raises the concerns that justices drift in unpredictable and undesirable ways, which encourages strategic behavior to enable an ideological friendly president to pick their replacement. Life tenure leads to longer terms, fewer vacancies, political battles over those vacancies, and life tenure makes justice more arrogant and self-regarding. Term limits proposal calls for 18-year terms, where each president will be entitled to 2 appointments per term, and 18-year terms will prevent justices from sitting until very old age and remove most advantages for presidents to appoint extremely young and less experienced nominees. The political stakes over each appointment would be reduced, and it will also encourage the more regular turnover, bringing fresh perspectives to the court and increasing the U.S. electorate and the court composition. Thank you.
So I have a couple questions on your model. What happens in the case of a vacancy?
Well, a couple arguments. In the vacancy of someone right now in the Supreme Court, or just in later?
For example, if someone doesn't live out those 18 years, or they might decide to retire before those 18 years are over.
Well, a couple examples. We would say one, we say how it's important to have term limits on how they are positioned. So even if there's a idea of like, oh, they're gonna retire or things like that, that's already happening in the status quo. The question is, can these judges be the most predictable, or at the very least, the best experienced judges within these, or within the Supreme Court?
So just to confirm, would it be like the status quo, where the president would then once again nominate someone and then lead to the Senate having to confirm?
Well, if you
Mind
want to
if I
answer
jump
this.
in? So they would nominate someone to fill that vacancy, but only for the amount of time left in that 18-year period, and then that person would cycle out, just like the person who originally had that job.
Okay, so you mentioned this idea of partisan warfare there then, and is part of that stonewalling from Congress?
Well, a couple arguments here. We would say that partisan warfare right now is something that's possible because of the polarization that's happening in the status quo. The ways in which there is a form or political extremism right now through the Conservative Party is something that allows there to always be tackles or decisions of like certain things. Roe v. Wade led to the political warfare of like, oh my God, is this really happening?
Sorry,
That tension is problematic.
Can you just answer that question really quick? Where it does partisan warfare include stonewalling from the Senate?
Well, from the Senate, if you want to answer this.
So we've made a couple of arguments that the Senate, while yes, you can make arguments that there would be filibustering, we've made a couple of arguments that say that that wouldn't happen. First, do you want to jump in from here to Marvin?
For sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, now
that we're on the same page.
Okay, for sure. The first argument I would make is that one, filibuster won't happen, right? We say that it's by having more legitimacy through the Supreme Court allows for the public to view the Supreme Court as something that's more legitimate and allows for reforms of Congress and things like that. So operationalize more easier in regards to Supreme Court things.
Okay, moving on. So you say that extreme conservatism is a problem in the status quo today, correct?
Yes, we give examples of how that's problematic, the
Okay.
overturning of Roe v. Wade, and how since Nixon there's been 17 out of 19 justices creating forms of decisions that,
Yes, so then therefore, is your plan contingent on Biden winning the next election?
Well, it's not a question of Biden. It's a question that polarization is inevitable. It's not a question whether Trump or Biden wins. It's a
But
question of
would
what do we do with or when a president is happening in the party.
But would you say that Trump is a conservative?
Well, we haven't made a claim in the app about that. We say that the most qualified judges should happen or be
But
on the
your
status
big
quo
problem in the status quo is extreme conservatism, correct?
because of polarization. If you
Okay.
want to
We
add.
would also say that if Trump wins the election, that would be the will of the people, and then the judges on that court would reflect the will of the people, which we've isolated as an independent good.
Even if
Because
he
that
didn't win the popular
representation-
vote?
We think that the topic is about whether or not Supreme Court term limits are good, not whether or not the Electoral College
Yeah,
is
so
bad.
you say that term limits are good because they decrease in extreme conservatism. I'm saying if Trump wins, would that or would that not increase conservatism, considering that a president who wins a term puts 2 nominations on, let's say another conservative president wins,
That
only
would
have
be the will of
do
the
you only
people,
have
which we've
solvency-
isolated as an independent good.
Okay, so do you only have solvency if liberal presidents win from here on out?
Well,
We've isolated that the will of the people is what
Yes.
the affirmative solves for to create Supreme Court legitimacy, which is the internal link to our impacts.
Okay. Moving on. So you say that you're against one party being unfairly represented. In the case that someone wins 2 terms, would that not lead to them having 44% of the court? Or if a party wins 3 terms, 4 terms, does that not lead to a
Again,
theological domination of the
I
court?
think this is the conflation that we're problematizing. It's not a question of whether they win X amount of years, because one, it's very unlikely. But two, the very notion of the will of the people is what's necessary, right? If that's what's happening, representation in the Supreme Court is necessary for that.
Thank you. The independence of the judges, once destroyed, would be lost forever. Nothing can contribute so much to its firmness and independence as permanency in office. It is because Simone and I agree with these words of our country's founding father, Alexander Hamilton, that we are proud to negate today's resolution. Framework.
In order to win today's debate, the affirmative must prove that the Supreme Court is so irreparably harmed that in an extremely partisan environment, we should change the way it has functioned for the past 200 years. They also must prove that term limits are necessary and sufficient and that any benefits outweigh the massive detriments of such a radical and unknown change. We have three contentions. The first is that term limits are not needed and fail. Second, that they undermine judicial independence. And third, they undermine doctrinal stability. Contention 1. Term limits aren't needed and fail. As Ayla Salman, professor of law at George Mason University, explains, the Supreme Court is not in a crisis and its legitimacy is resilient. For example, in 2005, after the Kelo decision, the court's approval was at 42%, then an all-time low, but quickly bounced back. Professor Salman goes on to say, quote, there is a similar story about the public reaction to such controversial and widely disliked rulings such as Roe v. Wade, Bush v. Gore, Citizens United, the school prayer cases, the flag burning cases, and others. In each of these situations, partisan critics of the ruling predicted that it would do long-term damage to the court's reputation. But public attention moved on to other issues, and the court's approval rating soon recovered. The affirmative has to show how lower approval ratings caused the court to collapse. According to Professor Salman, again, quote, of course, a crisis of legitimacy does not merely happen because the court makes the rulings that many people hate. Such decisions are issued almost every year, nor will it occur merely because many people believe the justice's rulings are influenced by politics. Rather, the court's legitimacy undergoes serious challenge only when a strong political movement seeks to curtail the court's authority to take drastic measures to subordinate its party in power. Unless they can prove that the status quo will result in attempts to take away their authority to try to change the current majority's influence, such as court packing, then the quote-unquote crisis the affirmative claims will never happen. And even post-Dobbs, there is no indication of that. Professor Salman shows, quote, even in the aftermath of Dobbs, most Democratic politicians are not advocating court packing or other measures to curb the justice's power. Thus, there is no impact to this so-called crisis of legitimacy. In addition, even if the court is in crisis and politicized, it is caused by actions outside of the court's control, namely the partisan appointment process. As Tara Legro, professor of law at William & Mary, writes, quote, the Supreme Court as a whole can do very little about the partisan maneuvering from the White House and the Senate. Thus, the court's legitimacy dilemma, its institutional reputation may suffer as a result of partisan fights largely outside of its control. Despite claims term limits reduce politicization, given the current climate and the high stakes of the court, there is no reason to believe that you can put the genie back in the bottle. A Fourth Circuit judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals, J. Harvey Wilkinson, argues that term limits will, quote, make the institution appear more, not less, political in the eyes of the public. Confirmation battles become more numerous but no less feverish, because 18 years is long enough to inflame partisan confirmation passions, especially if the court is closely divided. He continues, quote, the certainty that a seat will become vacant when the clock chimes the magical hour will only make the court subject of more continuing political parlor talk than it is already. Now, if we would like to truly minimize partisanship and bolster both the accountability and legitimacy of the court, binding judicial ethics are a promising answer. Binding judicial ethics would minimize violations of the law and mandate transparency from the court. By enforcing disclosures of gifts and financial interests, expanding the criteria for judge recusals, and providing robust mechanisms for review of complaints, these ethics would directly tackle potential conflicts of interest and ensure greater transparency and accountability within the court. This would not only strengthen the court's integrity, it would also reaffirm its impartiality to the people. Contention 2, judicial independence. The New York University Brennan Center for Justice shows that the current system of lifetime appointments serves to insulate the court from transient political influences and allows justices to render decisions based on the Constitution rather than political considerations. By imposing fixed terms, justices will feel pressure to align their decisions with the political ideology of the appointing party in order to secure future career opportunities post-retirement. This undermines the fundamental principle of judicial independence, as justice will prioritize partisan considerations over impartial interpretation of the law. The research emphasizes that the court's functional independence is essential to check the other political branches. For example, if cases go in front of the court regarding the other branch's power, justices would feel pressure to rule based on the party politics rather than the law, lest they upset the party that nominated them and destroy their future careers. This undermines the court's ability to maintain the separation of power, which are fundamental to securing our rights and preventing political violence and tyranny that would result from a constitutional crisis. Contention 3, stability. Senior editor of the Vanderbilt Law Review, Dr. Christopher Sunby, and Vanderbilt Law professor Susanna Sherry performed a comprehensive study showing that term limits will lead to a constant churn of laws and precedents, fundamentally altering the predictability and reliability that are indispensable for the functioning of society. At the core of any robust legal system lies the principle of predictability, as emphasized by a 2019 SCOTUS independent news and analysis. Having justice on the court for extensive periods of time means decades of experience on different cases and being part of the team. Especially crucial when it comes to the Chief Justice, who influences which cases will be heard, presides over oral arguments, leads discussion among the justices, and ultimately shapes the direction of the court. This leadership is important for maintaining stability. Chief Justice Roberts has led the philosophy of being committed to consensus building, often ruling with the majority and working to protect the legitimacy of the court. Consider the ramifications for businesses whose long-term planning and investments hinge on the stability of the legal framework. With term limits introducing a constant flux in the interpretation of laws and precedents, businesses would find themselves navigating an ever-shifting landscape fraught with uncertainty and risk. The impact extends beyond commerce to encompass the very rights and liberties of individuals. Citizens must be able to rely on a consistent interpretation of the law to safeguard their freedoms and protect against governmental overreach. Yet, as underscored by the analysis, term limits threaten to undermine this bedrock principle, leaving individuals vulnerable to capricious whims of the transient court. In conclusion, because term limits are not needed and fail, they undermine judicial independence and doctrinal stability we are proud to negate. Thank you.
Alright, my first question is, who in America thinks that the Supreme Court is an independent judiciary?
What do you mean?
Well, you talked about the arguments that the independence of judges is important, correct?
Yeah.
So, who in America thinks that the Supreme Court is an independent judiciary?
I would argue that like the Supreme Court is seen as an independent body that's meant to solely like interpret the law and like court the people.
Yes, but like by who? By the people?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Second question is, what makes it an independent judiciary? Is it only able to make its own decisions or anything else?
In the sense of like the way it interprets laws, what makes it an independent body?
What's the definitions of it being an independent judiciary?
Well, it being an independent judiciary is like when it interprets laws and sets precedents that it's not supposed to take anything into account other than like what the Constitution and like, its interpretations of the law specifically.
Okay, cool. Then you talk about the question of undermining legitimacy. That's happening right now in relation to Clarence Thomas going on vacation for conservatives, as well as the book signings of like Barrett that cost $2 million, right? How is this not unique to the status quo already?
Yeah, so that's why we suggest something like the binding judiciary, the legal judiciary findings, so that can address things like what Clarence Thomas is doing right now. And the legitimacy argument that we're getting to is that when we have these turnovers that are so consistent, there's going to be legal frameworks that are consistently changed, laws that are consistently changed over and over that are creating this legitimacy and distrust of the public of the Supreme Court.
So my next question is, assuming that this ethics is something that's viable, right? Would it need to go through the Supreme Court to make it possible, or who would implement this?
So we could have something such as an independent like commission made up of lower appellate chief justices that then go on to decide. We could have the public submit a report of ethics violations. They could look into it and then report back.
Yeah,
Right.
we could take a look at the Supreme Court ethics, recusal, and transparency ethics.
The next question I have, thank you.
Thank you.
That's all I needed from you.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. My next question is on stability. You cite this study, right, on limits. This study only took into account Roe v. Wade. How does this influence, or at the very least take into account, the rest of the decisions that the Supreme Court did?
What do you mean?
So there was a study on the stability, correct?
Yes.
That looked at things such as Roe v. Wade only. How does this take into consideration other decisions that the Supreme Court did?
So we talk about stability in the sense of, again, the changing laws, the changing precedents, and how stability is needed in our country now.
Yes, and you have an example that someone did a survey or a program under stability, under your third contention. My argument is that in that study only took into consideration Roe v. Wade. How does that implicate the other decisions of the Supreme Court?
That there needs to be stability in the court. I'm not
It's
understanding
okay.
your question.
No, it's
Sorry.
okay. My last question, actually, do you have a question actually?
No.
Okay, cool. So in terms of the packing the courts argument, why would this increase the legitimacy of the court decision? Because you said we wouldn't pack the courts, correct?
What would impact the courts?
Well, you made the arguments about packing the courts. No? You didn't make arguments about packing the courts?
No.
Okay,
I can
cool.
remember now.
Sounds good. So the final question, I guess now that I have time, is when you talk about fixed terms, what does ethics do that does not, I guess, link to the dissents that you talked about through this board of ethics? How does it evade the problems of the pro side?
It's not term limits.
Non-term limits? Okay. Is that the only way that ethics works, or is that the only alternative that you presented?
Well, in the fact that it's not term limits, it avoids the disadvantages of instability of like undermining the legitimacy.
There is an overwhelming problem that fundamentally shapes this debate. Supreme Court legitimacy is at an all-time low. The overturn of Roe v. Wade has caused massive public backlash, which is magnified by the reality that this is the most conservative Supreme Court in recent memory. Despite the will of the people being more Democratic than Republican, the only way to increase legitimacy is by making the Supreme Court a democratic institution more like Congress or the President, a body that the will of the people controls. The only way to accomplish this is via term limits. Miami says that the presented a framework for this debate, but the only framework that matters is whether the affirmative proves that the term limits are a good idea, because that is what the resolution stipulates we must do. That is the most predictable framework for this debate and the one you should prefer. Next, we have 3 advantages to our affirmative. The first is civil unrest. Let's be honest, the chance that an election lands before the Supreme Court is incredibly high. If the court is seen as illegitimate, the public has no reason to accept their decision, no matter who they rule in favor of. That's a recipe for civil unrest and violence. We know that it's a possibility because January 6th showed us what happens when a group of people lose faith in institutions. The point is that to avoid civil unrest, the public needs to be able to have faith that the court will do the right thing, something directly tied to legitimacy. This is a contention that the counterplan of judicial ethics can't solve, because it does not make the court beholden to the people and the power of their vote. Our second advantage is conservatism. We must all acknowledge that the dangers of the current court, they have taken away or are slated to take away environmental protections, women's rights, voting rights, separation of church and state, and more. Under our plan, the most conservative justices, because they are the most senior members of the court, would be the first to be cycled out of the court and replaced by new justices. These justices would likely be more moderate, because Democrats and Republicans wouldn't want to create the precedent of massive fights and filibusters of justices, because they wouldn't want that to happen to them when it's their turn. As a result, only our plan can protect rights and ensure a moderate court. This is a tension that the CP can't solve, because it leaves the current justices in place. This solves their argument that judges would be politicized in the confirmation process. I did that work above about moderate judges being more moderate. And finally, the AF results in the selection of better justices for 2 reasons. First, term limits means that there's no incentive to select young and unexperienced judges in the hopes that they will be on the court for a long time. And 2, they prevent justices from sitting on the court longer than makes sense, given the decline in mental acuity that comes with age. This is another contention that the CEP can't solve, because it leaves the current justices in place. The negative had no direct response to any of our contentions, meaning that you should give them a lot of weight in your decision. I'll go to the line by line now. First, they say that there's no need for term limits because they fail, and Supreme Court legitimacy always bounce back. But in the past, the court hasn't continued to make increasingly radical decisions, one after another, which I outlined above. They say that we have to prove that the Supreme Court is going to collapse, but that's not our argument. Our argument is that legitimacy is key to belief in the institution, and when we believe in institutions, we can protect ourselves from things like civil unrest. Next, they say that our only impact is the Dobbs case, but our impact is civil unrest, better judges, and a moderation of the Supreme Court. I already answered their politics argument and embedded our answers to the judicial ethics counterplan, meaning that the only other 2 arguments I have to answer are 1, judicial jobs post-retirement, but that could be happening now. They have no reason why judges wouldn't retire now in the status quo to take on new jobs if they wanted to do that already. Amy Coney Barrett has a $2 million book deal. Judges can walk and chew gum at the same time. This is already happening in the status quo and not resulting in major impacts, meaning that there is no reason not to try term limits. And their argument about stare decisis and investment turnover is an AF argument. It will always be better to have liberal decisions for some period of time than to not have them at all. Think about abortion and how many women exercise their right to self-determination in a single day. It's also better to have the court reflect the will of the people, because they are tied to the vote and function more like Congress or the presidency. And the AF solves the disadvantage advantage. The AF creates better judges by ensuring that those on the court are in the prime of their career. That ensures better decision making, which is key to investment climates, which is the main internal link to the argument that the negative is going for. But the dissad has no coherent internal link. One, investors have no incentive to leave the U.S., which would be the only option if they're not going to invest into the U.S. economy. We have the strongest economy in the world, and the demand for the product or innovation is what's driving investment, not the possibility of Supreme Court turnover. Two, the negative has no evidence that the court would continue to grant cert to cases that would affect investment year after year, especially since the court only hears a handful of cases a year, and those cases would have to make their way up through the Court of Appeals, which is a long and drawn-out process. All of this means that we have three uncontested advantages, none of which the counterplan can solve, and the AF solves this dissad that has no internal link, meaning that you should vote AF. I'm open for cross-ex. Yep.
Alright, so you talked about during your plan that the cycling, it would first cycle out the conservatives on the court. So like, how would you ensure, you said that like moderates are most likely to replace these conservatives. How would that be ensured? Like, what is the logic behind that?
Sure. So the way the plan works is that it would cycle out the most senior members of the court, which happen to be three of the most conservative members of the court. So that's where that comes from. It's not ad hoc. Second, you've made arguments that the process of nominating judges would be incredibly politicized. We agree that it would likely be politicized if they continued to pick justices that were on either end of the political spectrum. So instead of doing that, they're more likely to appoint judges who are closer to the political middles to avoid filibustering, because they don't want to be filibustered. The people who would be filibustered or who would do the filibustering don't want to be filibustered when it's their turn. So it's easier for everyone to get a judge through if they're moderate on both sides and much closer to the middle at least.
Okay, but this isn't something that can absolutely be ensured, right? We really don't know if like the new appointed will be moderate, right? They could be equally as conservative, hence no solvency, correct?
That would just mean that there would be a contentious fight and judges would likely get through anyway. We've seen contentious fights happen in the status quo, like Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh. Those judges got appointed and made it to the court anyway. And we would say that that would be the will of the people under the other part of our contention.
Okay, got it. But it is still a possibility, right? Just yes or no?
Well, it's not a question.
It's not a yes or no question, and we've argued that our authors point to that this would be what would happen. We're not going to tell you our AF doesn't solve.
Okay. So when you talk about like how we're cycling out the conservatives, I know you said it had to do with like age and seniority. So it wouldn't be like let's say at a point in time we're now dominated by Democrats, right? We wouldn't cycle out the Democrats to level out the playing field, right? That's not what you're saying? I just wanna
We
clarify.
cycle people out by their seniority on the court, and then once the court is made up of people that have been entirely in these that were a part of these 2-year appointments for presidents, then it would be every 18 years. So cycling out just has to do with the current members of the court, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I just wanted clarification. Can you please also expand on your economic point? I didn't really understand it.
Yeah, so you made arguments that precedent changing on the court would be bad for investment climates. And we're making the argument that we create better justices on the court, which I can go into if you want me to. But those better justices would ensure better decision making, which is key to investment climates. More faith in those judges would create a better investment climates. And we also think that investors have no incentive to leave the United States, which is the largest economy in the world, and demand for production or innovation is what drives investment, not Supreme Court decisions. And that you also have made an argument that the Supreme Court would continue to grant cert to cases that they've already ruled on over and over and over again, especially since the Court of Appeals would have to have those cases come up through the system to the Supreme Court anyway. So we think that they're kind of a threefold problem, if that makes sense.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I'm just trying to link it with the argument that we made about like economics right now, how like consistently changing legal frameworks would affect businesses, would affect like livelihoods. How is that connected? Or it's not, it's just a separate point. I have clarification.
So we think that what would affect businesses is investors into those businesses. That's what would affect it. Or Supreme Court regulations, which we think these arguments still apply to those, to your claim.
Okay, perfect, thank you, that's fine.
Are the judges ready? All right, commence ready?
In 1 second. Yep.
Is my partner ready? Then I will begin on my next turn. The Supreme Court has functioned with life tenure since its founding, surviving over 2 centuries of divisiveness, from FDR threatening the Pact Accord to Brown v. Board to Bush v. Gore. This is a testament to the court's resilience in the face of polarization. Given that history has proven the court's ability to persist through political turmoil, we cannot justify making radical changes to the way it functions just because tensions are heightened once again, especially since turmoil is starting to undermine judicial independence from the other branches. And in the words of Montesquieu, there is no liberty if the power of judging is not separated from the legislative and executive powers. Leo's Bratian turmoils aren't needed, as unpopular Supreme Court decisions never have and never will actually take away their authority, and has demonstrated how they fail to solve any of the polarization seen today. Further, she has shown how life tenure is needed for judicial independence and for the court to effectively check the power of the other branches. Finally, she has shown you that term limits uniquely harm stability. I will extend on our second and third contentions by demonstrating how implementing term limits leads to tyranny of the majority and the disruption of the court's dynamics. I will start with some line-by-line rebuttal of the affirmative case. The affirmative has come up here today and told you that a major problem in the status quo is extreme conservatism. They tell you that it's mostly Republican justices, which has affected LGBTQ rights, and the overruling of Roe v. Wade is a major problem. In cross-ex, I asked them, wouldn't conservatism on the court not increase if we were to elect a conservative president, such as Donald Trump? And they said that it will just, that because it is the will of the people, that is okay. But they do not then solve for any of the conservative points that they mentioned. Additionally, the affirmative is going all in on an incredibly risky bet. Polls from 538.com show that in the last 39 polls taken from the national election this month, only 4 predicted a Democrat win for the presidential election. In addition, they say that we need more moderate justices and that we're making increasingly radical decisions. This is just not true. McGrath v. Georgia 2017 expanded the civil rights of criminal defendants in double jeopardy. Allen v. Milligan 2021 protected voting rights of Black Alabama voters. Muldrow v. City of St. Louis lowered the bar for proving that transfer decisions can cause harm for you, therefore making it easier to sue for wrongful transfers. We do not believe that the court is making increasingly radical decisions. Instead, we believe that they are making impressively moderate decisions. Okay. On their point of more representation, they say that they want to make the justices less insulated from everyday life. They want to reflect the will of the people. This sounds good on the surface, but once you go deeper, it actually has very sinister implications, as it will result in the tyranny in the majority, which I will extend upon in my contention too. And in addition, this will touch on their point that one party is overrepresented in the status quo. They will just make this worse. As we said, if just one party wins 3 terms, 4 terms, that ideologically dominates the court, which is going to lead to the tyranny of the majority, which I'll go into later. Legitimacy. They hinder a lot of their case on the fact that we're losing legitimacy. However, we are not actually facing a current legitimacy crisis. Yes, SCOTUS has made controversial rulings, but the court has persisted in the face of polarization for 200 years. Additionally, the public might not see this as actually legitimate, considering that the president that they voted for might not win. Second of all, the president that didn't win the popular vote might also be put in place. We believe that these are not going to inherently make the court more legitimate and could make it worse by making it more political than it could already be. On this point of qualified justices, they believe that there's going to be more qualified justices on their side, but they fail to recognize that they lose institutional knowledge. Life tenure allows people to gain decades of experience on the courts. And in addition, my partner has shown you how, for example, this could affect the Chief Justice, as Chief Justice Roberts has been a key qualified justice in today's court with guiding decisions and coming to the most equitable outcomes. Additionally, extreme partisanship. They believe that they're going to mitigate extreme partisanship, but this is not true. It makes an institution more, not less, political. As I already explained, confirmation battles become more numerous, but no less feverish, since 18 years is still plenty of time to wield influence. Instead of making judicial vacancies less polarizing, we will just be increasing them, and we will be giving Congress, like Mitch McConnell, just more opportunities to stonewall. They even conceded that stonewalling is possible in their model. We do not believe that just because term limits are being implemented, that Republicans and Democrats are just going to play nice, especially considering the hyper-polarized climate of today's politics. Additionally, if we thought it was disruptive when just one person left the court, imagine how destabilizing and disruptive it would be if we had to do this every couple of years. So in the words of Anthony Markham, University of Michigan lecturer, term limits will not lower the temperature around nominations, they will leave the country scorched. In addition, we believe that we solve for a lot of what they mentioned in our and alternatives such as binding judicial ethics. It could improve legitimacy of the court, as people will come to see that that these justices can have real forms of accountability. We could curb these sketchy dealings, giving the public less of a reason to perceive justices as being partial. We could curb corruption. We could curb partisanship because people aren't going to be seeing this us versus them mentality. So we believe that a lot of the benefits we're going to say, we can do with judicial term limits, and we can do it less radically because we're not reinventing the wheel. We're just defining the Constitution's clause of good behavior. Okay, going into our contention, judicial independence and my expansion of tyranny of the majority. Tyranny of the majority. The idea that term limits will allow for the court to be more representative with the public, with what the public wants, sounds like a good idea in theory. But let's imagine this perfect affirmative world where the court is constantly updating to reflect whatever is most popular. The same party wins just 3 or 4 terms and they ideologically dominate the court. This completely screws over the minority, be that 1% versus 99%, or 49% versus 51%. If we are always voting for what best fits the majority, then the Supreme Court has failed to ensure justice for all. Let's not forget that some Supreme Court rulings that are now held in high regard were not so popular when they were first implemented, such as Brown v. Board, the ruling that declared separate but equal unconstitutional, faced fierce and often violent massive resistance. We can also see today that a lot of these cases that are net good were controversial at first and were not in line with what the public wanted. Lawrence v. Texas said that sodomy laws were unconstitutional, and IB versus Sibelius ruled that the Medicare Act was constitutional under the taxing and spending clause. Jeffrey Rosen, a National Constitution Center, states, quote, "The court at its best has often appeared to defend fundamental principles of freedom and equality in the face of popular opposition. We believe that this just exemplifies how the court has had a rather impressive ability to stay moderate even in the face of overwhelming popular opposition. In a society that is already structured in favor of the majority, it becomes clear that when it comes to protecting the minority's individual rights, it is far more important to focus on what's written in the Constitution over what's popular." Over the process.
Okay. Sorry, I'm apparently not smarter than my timer. There we go. Okay. Are you aware that Justice Thomas has received millions of dollars worth of gifts and lavish vacations
Yes,
from Republican donors?
which is why judicial binding ethics would be good.
Sure. Are you aware that Justice Alito has taken many fishing trips that are worth millions of dollars?
Yes, which is why binding judicial ethics would be good.
Okay. Do you think either of those two things are good for Supreme Court legitimacy?
Yes. We think that judicial ethics are good for Supreme Court legitimacy, not the 2 examples you provided.
Okay, so the 2 things that I said are not good for Supreme Court legitimacy.
No,
Great.
which is
So
why it's good that we curb it with judicial.
I got that part.
binding
So
ethics.
the Dobbs leak of the Supreme Court case in February 2022, was that good for Supreme Court legitimacy?
Yeah.
Okay. The 303 creative case that ruled that wherein the Supreme Court ruled that religious rights are a reason that you can deny business transactions to LGBTQ couples. Is that good for Supreme Court legitimacy?
So I'm not seeing your link here then to how you improve it with term limits. If this is going back to your conservative
That's
extremism
not the
point,
question I
then we
asked.
already showed you that it could lead to Donald Trump becoming more. Yeah, it wasn't good for legitimacy,
Okay.
but you don't get that on your side.
So given that all of these things being true, why is the Supreme Court not in a legitimacy crisis now?
The Supreme Court is not in a legitimacy crisis now because we've already provided you evidence that shows that even in the face of highly controversial decisions, the Supreme Court has managed to persist.
But has all of those things ever happened together all at the same time? Leaks, donor violations, Supreme Court, the legalization of discrimination against a protected class,
We've
taking
seen
away
highly
abortion
controversial
rights.
cases in the past.
But I'm
already
asking if
mentioned-
anything has ever gone to the level of that. If you can compare me to a point of history where that was similar to all of those things happening at the same time.
We've already showed you, like, during the Civil Rights Movement, during Bush v. Gore, these were things that were highly controversial, and the court continued to persist anyway.
Okay, so you make the argument that that Donald Trump would lead to winning the election would lead to more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. We've made the argument that the justices that would be appointed by Trump through the new process would have to be more moderate in order to make it past the filibuster.
So
Why doesn't that solve your
We
argument?
don't agree at all. If we think that the president is trying to win over their party, they're going to lean to extreme. And in addition, even if
But
we buy that
it's not about winning
moderate
over the
justices.
party, it's about whether or not you can get them through the Senate.
Okay, so then what if the Senate aligns with the president? Like, we don't believe that ultimately it's a good idea for the president to be able to continue to nominate people from their party because they can
Democrats currently have a majority in the Senate. Have you
just
read
saying-
evidence that they're going to win in 2024?
that the president
The
will vote
Republicans are going to take over the Senate?
Yes, we've already shown you evidence from polls from 538.com that in the last 39 polls taken for the national election this month, only 4 predicted a Democrat win for the presidential election. We think
That's
that
the
it's a
presidential
incredibly
election, not the Senate.
Okay, well, even in the Senate, we just think it's not a risky. We think it's too risky of a bet to make. If your entire points come on the contingency that a Democrat president is elected, then we believe that that is ultimately too risky.
We've made the argument that that's not the case, but we'll continue on with questions. So you make the argument that the Chief Justice is particularly key to a qualified knowledge base. Why?
We believe that the Chief Justice, we're tying it back to your point that qualified justices are important. We believe that you get more institutional knowledge on our side, therefore making you more qualified. In your world, someone has 18 years, they could do more, and there could be more, and that could lead to more qualification. However, then you get rid of them, put someone new in, you're not getting more qualified justices, you're getting more.
Roberts has been on the court for exactly 20 years. What is particularly great about his institutional knowledge that you wouldn't get in 18? What's the difference between 18 and 20?
So we don't have to say what the difference between 18 and 20 is. We're just saying that that the more you have, the more qualified you're going to be. We can see justice having a longer run, and we think that that's ultimately a good thing.
Anyone not ready? Yep. You will? Cool. Cool. Banner, panel, tones. Audience? Okay. Stream? No. Given that this debate is about a debate of the Supreme Court, we should be asking what is the best process of jurisprudence. At the end of this debate, we know that the court will always be here and it will always be politicized. The question now is, should we make it better, a better institution in a world of politicization, or concede to a super conservative court that has overturned Roe v. Wade, has had no regard for death row inmates, and are the founding of colorblind values that insinuate the overruling of minority LGBTQ and women's rights? There is only one correct answer to our affirmative. We must face the instances of global climate change, civil unrest, and the loss of many different rights, with the possibility of the best forms of judges who are the most qualified and experienced in the Supreme Court. The pro side affirms for an 18-year term limit, which will happen immediately. We are the only team that have provided you with the scope of what the public wants. 67% of Americans want this to happen. The negative has not been able to give to you an instance of where the American thinks otherwise. This is why we are the most preferable method for 3 reasons. 1, One, we allow for Goldilocks judges. Term limits allow for the best forms of judges that are the most experienced and at the height of their career. It allows them to make the most fair approach to the inevitable form of politicization of the people. Why listen to Alexander Hamilton when you can listen to the current American population? This is why you need our affirmative. We allow us to access to the Supreme Court justices that are the most experienced and in their prime, instead of having justices that have the least amount of experience or are too old to have mental deterioration. This reduces the most amount of stability and legitimacy. The negative instance or argument that we should allow for non-term limits is problematic because it justifies the idea of mental deterioration and allows for the instances of violence that happen through Roe v. Wade, etc. They will get up here and say examples that happen in historical, i.e. Bush v. Gore, i.e. Barr versus education. Cool. The argument is that they have not grappled with the problems that has caused for the American population, i.e. the civil unrest that is possible, i.e. January 6th, i.e. the segregation and the violence that black individuals face in the instance of Board v. education. It is not a question of whether the Supreme Court will inevitably make these decisions. It's a question of how can we tackle them best. Now onto their loss of institutional knowledge. One, it will not happen. The negative team has not provided you with the bright line on what institutional knowledge is. If it is the reproduction of Roe v. Wade, the rejection of minority and women's rights, you should not support it. The premise of having no tenure rights ignores the impact of mental deterioration that I did above, and it means that the American public should be good and you should earn their favor, i.e. term limits. Now, entering the Trump would appoint conservative justices. One is the will of the people. Tying justices to the ballot via the president would mean that if Trump wins and appoints more conservatives who rule in the conservative ways, that's what the people want. That still solves legitimacy because the people will have spoken, and it means that they have an impact on how they could talk about Supreme Court justices and their decisions. This is important for how we talk about the processes of the Supreme Court. Two is that these justices will likely be more moderate because Democrats and Republicans would not want to create the president of massive fights and filibusters of justices because they wouldn't want that to happen to them when it is their turn. As a result, only our plan can protect the rights and ensure a moderate count. Two is civil unrest. The court will have a high probability of influencing any presidential elections in the future. Therefore, we don't know when the next Bush v. Gore will happen, but when it does happen, we need the most qualified judges in that instance. Only the affirmative has provided you with methods and ideas of what the most qualified judges are. Ones that are not tied to the normative ways of, oh look, hey, that's a $2 million deal, I might need to take it. No, this is problematic and what the negative team justifies for. And next on their line by line, they ignore the forms of civil unrest that already occurred in the moments of the status quo, and their preservation of saying the Supreme Court is still good is problematic because it means that extreme conservatism will always happen. We would have the first three long tenured judges, aka the justices, Roberts, Alito, and Thomas, be relinquished given the immediate change in the composition of the Supreme Court. So even if there is a constant Republican win, it takes away the political extremism that is found within those three individuals that allow for things such as the loss of minority and LGBTQ rights to be possible. And given the aforementioned argument about, hey, they're going to be more moderate is good because it proves that even if there's conservative judges joining, it'll be better, not better than the status quo. And given the immediate change in the composition of the Supreme Court with a wider array of thinking and thought processes, this helps us solve for climate change, different rights, and stop civil violence, something that their current plan is unable to solve for because one, they just continue the same types of non-tenure limits, which is problematic because it doesn't change the mentality that these Supreme Court justices have. It means that they won't be able to have the be at the height of their career, which is the most important way to make a decision-making calculus for the American population. Remember, every loss of representational freedom increases sexual violence for women and racial tensions to minorities. This is why we need more moderate judges to do two things. One, it challenges the conservatism that is allowed for the decisions such as that, and it means it is problematic. Cool. CP. One, we are very ahead on the counterplan question. One is we will bring it to the Eisen and Matsuker piece of evidence that indicates how the term limits is the best way for the American population to justify what should happen in the Supreme Court. I'm not just going to say, hey, look, they just say it's good, but given that they are looking at the polling reports that are asking Chief Justice year-end report in 2021, it justifies what public view is important. The counterplan is unable to actually grapple with what the American people want. And there is no distinction between creating perform ethics under tenure limits. At best, the example they're going to say is Chief Justice Roberts, aka 20 years is not different than 18 years, and he already has institutional knowledge. Meaning the only thing we could do is vote affirmative for both models to occur.
So I just wanted to introduce myself again. I'm Leia from the University of Miami. I am graduating in 2 weeks, so this is my last ever college speech. Alright, so just a quick roadmap. I'll be doing framework and then my theory and first. Okay, starting time now. So world to world. Let's take the affirmative at their best. They get a Democratic president that we have shown you to be unlikely, who gets to put 2 nominations on the court. This still decreases instability, erodes judicial independence, and can lead to extreme partisanship. You still vote for the negative world, even at our worst. We don't get rid of hyper-conservative Clarence Thomas for another few years. We still have a court that makes rather moderate decisions. We have shown you cases of McLaren v. Georgia, Allen v. Milligan, Muldrow v. City of St. Louis, that were progressive decisions even given the conservative supermajority. We maintain stability and institutional knowledge, and we can still curb ethics scandals and improve legitimacy through binding judicial ethics. Framework. I would like to again just reiterate the framework of today's debate that the affirmative must prove the unique benefits to term limits, and they have failed to do so, and they have must. Okay, so I would first like to take a broader scope of today's debate. In the most recent affirmative speech, it was emphasized how we need to address specifically the American people, address January 6th. We need the most qualified judges, stop civil violence. Okay, great. How do term limits solve? We hear about the moderate judges needed for women and for minorities. How do term limits solve? They said term limits are the best way to identify what's happening with American people, and it reflects polling. Literally nothing can ensure who those new appointed nominees are. There is no unique solve or solve alone by term limits. The affirmative claims that they can solve climate change, LGBTQ rights, etc. through getting more moderate judges. To reiterate, we have shown you how the court already makes moderate decisions. By tying to elections, it's more extreme decisions. Contention 1, term limits aren't needed and fail. Legitimacy cannot be denied on the public's opinions on rulings so long as the decisions continue to be followed and enforced. And we have never seen anything but this being done in the last 2 centuries. There is absolutely no warrant in the affirmative argument that we are currently in a time where the court is losing its power. When we just Google the public's approval ratings, these ratings are 3 times higher than that of the court that they are of Congress. By the affirmative logic, would this not mean that the Congress is also in crisis and needs such drastic change as term limits? This is not truly about crisis and legitimacy. This is about politics. This is about the court right now being dominated by conservatives and opposing parties wanting this to be changed. But okay, let's assume that there is an issue of polarization that needs to be addressed. We currently hold a predominantly conservative court, and the term limits that the affirmative is suggesting would be ones that apparently level this playing field. Okay, how? How can this be ensured? How can it be ensured that turnover would play in favor of the Democrats? The affirmative said that there's incentive for those newly appointed justices to be chosen on their more moderate views, but there is 0 evidence. Why is there 0 evidence? Because there is absolutely no way that this can be ensured. It is just as likely that the new appointed justices are conservatives and that we're in the same place as when we started. When has Trump ever played in the moderates win? And you know what? Fine. Let's say those newly appointed justices are Democrats. Those newly appointed are now in the court with a conflict of interest as they simultaneously gain incentives behind election outcomes. So let's take a look at judicial binding ethics. Both the negative and the affirmative have agreed today that there are questioning ethics on the court with undisclosed payments and bribery. That's exactly why we propose such ethics. These ethics are only one of several options that could reap the benefits of upholding democracy and accountability that the affirmative is looking for, while avoiding the detrimental risk of undermining judicial independence and doctrinal stability. Contention 2, judicial independence. Simone and I believe that the tyranny of the majority is one of the key winning points of today's debate because we protect the rights of the minority. Implementing term limits could unintentionally turn the Supreme Court into a mere reflection of the prevailing majority, sidelining minority viewpoints and risking majoritarian overreach. This approach contradicts the court's historical role in safeguarding fundamental rights against popular opposition. Key decisions like Brown v. Board of Education and Lawrence v. Texas were initially unpopular, demonstrating the importance of judicial independence from current majority views. Rawson highlights that the court's best moments often arise from defending core principles against popular resistance. By potentially allowing minority opinion to dictate judicial appointments frequently, term limits can undermine the enduring values that the court is meant to uphold. As NYU Brennan Center underscored, justices will feel pressure to align their decisions with political ideology of the appointing party in order to secure future career appointments post-retirement. Again, just imagine if there's a case on the power of another branch. If a justice rules on their fear of upsetting their nominating party rather than the law, we lose a separation of powers that are imperative to securing our rights and preventing political violence and tyranny from a constitutional crisis that we aimlessly risk through term limits. Contention 3, stability. Dependency and reliability on the law means everything. Think about the effect on the economy. How can a business plan to expand with the laws and regulations changing every few years? There can be no informed decision-making with consistently changing legal frameworks. And don't just think about the business. Think about the people. Think about their livelihoods. The stability of laws directly impact people's ability to support themselves and their families. And please don't forget our critical point on the consistent turnover of the Chief Justice, a critical point that the affirmative has failed to address. When we remove Chief Roberts, who's going to take his place? Is it the person that's going to be out in 2 years, or is it going to be someone that's completely new? Both of these options are absolutely terrifying to think for someone who's meant to be leading such a fundamental body. As we stand on the brink of change, let us remember the risks posed by the affirmative proposal. The unknown consequences of term limits far outweigh any theoretical benefits that they may promise. Promises that they address that sounded really great in their speech, and that I, as a minority myself, really do wish could be solved with something as simple as term limits. But this is not the reality in a world where this is not the reality. We are in a world where the stakes are high and the risks are real, and we cannot afford to gamble with the future of our judicial system. Judges, you should vote negative because we abide to the framework of this debate, where 1, we prove that we are not in a state of crisis, therefore there's no critical need for immediate implementation of term limits, and 2, even if you buy that there is a crisis, there are detrimental risks to the affirmative plan. Thank you for your participation.
Congratulations to both teams for making it to the final round and having an amazing debate. Firmly believe that these are the types of conversations that we need to be having in all campuses across the United States, and it would significantly go a long way to dealing with the political polarization that you were talking about if we can do this. The winner on a 2-1 decision was the negative from Miami.
I get to go first. This is awesome in some ways, but not as awesome as seeing this debate. Let me just echo a little bit of what Professor Lee just talked about. We have to have more space in place for conversation, more space in place for dialogue and discussion. And what just took place here over the last hour or so was an example that it is finest. And so I just want to congratulate all 4 of you for being willing to do something that most people find really hard to do, and that is to get up and speak publicly in front of a room full of people, but also to put the time and energy it is to prepare yourself. So kudos to you, and may other people that see this get inspired to also do the same. With that being said, for me, this debate, it was close, but there was parts of this debate that I thought that the affirmative was doing a little bit better job on. Really, for me, what part of this debate came down to this time frame of right now, needing to put something in place before the elections. This was a critical distinction that they were making throughout the debate, that their plan gets implemented now. And because it gets implemented now, the only way I think to access some of those civil unrest, some of the impacts that they're articulating, is to vote for the AF. In addition to that, I think these issues around rights, climate change, civil unrest, I think they're doing a better job of winning the argument that because you have term limits, you get better types of judges that are more moderate, that are more at the high, as you all frame it, the best at their, I don't know if that's an ageism argument. I mean, get there now about just because you are at the highest of your legal abilities, that means that you're better in making decisions. But that's the argument they're putting forth. That I don't hear the Miami team making as a persuasive arguments as I thought the Wake Forest team did. So that's kind of the crux of where my decision lied. But I thought this was a really wonderful debate, and I'm really proud that I had the opportunity to watch this between all 4.
Thank you.
I'd also like to commend both teams. I thought this was a phenomenal debate. I think there are few ways more effective in sort of analyzing questions like this than to put it in front of 4 really smart young people like you, and here you just go back and forth head to head on it. I've learned so much today through this process of observing y'all, and so I really want to thank you for that and just commend you for your work. Ultimately, I thought that Wake Forest, y'all were making a lot of great arguments. It got really close for me in the final rebuttals. I think that just sort of looking at it from a big picture, what really appealed to me was first the big picture thinking I felt like we had from Miami, which was we're going to look at more of a larger analysis of what we should be looking at. We're going to focus on a core argument, and we're going to develop that argument. And then also my background as a lawyer, they're really speaking to me. The notion of we want to really increase the court as a vehicle of the people's will, as opposed to the unique role the court playing being something that is to resist sometimes the will of the people. The notion that the majority doesn't need the court to protect them because of the majority. It's the minority who needs the court to protect them. That really speaks to me, and the notion of don't risk disrupting a 200-year system based on what seems like a lot of speculation. I think if you developed your arguments, if you had time, you always, choice is tragic in a debate like this, and you have 3 different judges you're speaking to. As I said, it was really close, but that was what really tilted me towards those 2 sort of things.
I think there are 2 impacts that you have that you're going for. One is this sort of liberal moderating agenda advantage, which has the bigger sort of impacts to it: climate change, rights, pandemics, diseases. Like, can we sort of institutionalize a court that would allow for us to deal with some of those sets of issues? And then the sort of democratic process kinds of arguments, which is sort of your will of the people argument. I don't think that there's a unique advantage to the first one First, I think that they have an argument of this sort of litany of ways in which the court seems to be moderating now with some decisions. There's not a large scale amount of pushback on that. I think that you've got ways in which the court is not, but I do think that it sort of starts to cut against that. I also thought that this sort of notion of, I do think that disadvantage is very much tied to there being a liberal, progressive, moderate executive that gets into play to at least initiate some of those judges. They've read some evidence that says, at least in this term, that Trump is more likely to become president. I thought that you probably should have made a more structural argument that just structurally the Electoral College and the Senate means that it is far more likely that those institutions are going to be Republican dominated just due to the way in which we structured those systems. So a more structural argument, I thought, would have been more powerful and persuasive, but I do think that that starts to cut against that advantage as well. And to a little smaller degree, I think that this sort of judicial ethics can sort of curtail some of that, not as much as some of the other things that I talked about. So I think that that advantage becomes relatively small in what I give you some unique impact to. You now have this will of the people argument, and I think you're correct, Jess, you're right from the start of this, that you're like, even if they win those arguments, we have this will of the people argument, but I don't really have an impact to that ever really sort of articulated from an AF side perspective. They have this majoritarian tyranny DA, which is functionally the impact turn to your will of the people argument, and they have articulated an impact to why that would be problematic. It sort of hardwires in ideological dominance. It is something that starts to violate some of the rights of particular people, minority folks. So a lot of the things that you were talking about in the first advantage, I think, becomes problematized by their majoritarian tyranny argument. And so very little risk of your first advantage, and I think that this tyranny, majoritarian tyranny DA is the only impact that's to the sort of will of the people argument. And I think that that becomes sort of dispositive for me, the larger scale thing that I'm interested in voting on.
We say all that to say this was a good debate.